Just sticking around for a little bit of a talk. Oh, thank you. I'll introduce myself and then we'll pass around to the right. So my name's Joseph Cullen and I am from Somerset, which is a very rural part of the UK, about 100 or so miles out of London. And I am the executive producer of the company. The company is run by Sasha and myself. We've co-written the play over the last number of years, and of course we were both in the play as well. So yeah, I'll pass, that's who I am. My name's Joe, you can call me Joe for brevity. I'll pass over to Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha, Sasha Wilson. I am the artistic director of Ador Theatre, co-writer of the play, and my family is Bulgarian, and we were introduced to this story via a book that was on my grandfather's bookshelf. But had I not stumbled across it one rainy afternoon, we wouldn't be here sharing this incredible and complex story with you all. And to discuss creating narratives out of lived history, albeit in a different medium, is the lovely Melissa Hacker, who, as many of you I'm sure will know, is the executive director of the Kinder Transport Association and a documentary filmmaker.
Yes. And I am from New York. I grew up here. So, we want to bring everyone into the conversation to ask questions, but first, just sort of to start. This is the first time I've seen it live. I saw a video, so it's amazing to see it live, and that is definitely one of the differences between working in film and working with live theater, that in film, it's done. And it's there, but you can change, and the energy can be so different every night. But so I want start with a broad question. So my first film was a documentary about the Kinder transports, which I knew very little about. In the same way of not finding a book, but finding my mother and starting to ask her questions. But the film itself, I started with the idea I want to tell this story, went through so many iterations, and some stories could be told and some couldn't. So how, did you write this in 2 days and it was done? Or, what changed from finding that book and how? Yeah.
It did not get written in 2 days. I wish. I think what was very clear to us very, very early on was a kind of an understanding of the main core characters that we were going to include, and the desire to, as much as possible, foreground the women and the powers behind the throne that were really the grassroots effort by which we think the public tide of opinion swayed King Boris into making the decision that he wound up making. And also very, very early on, we made a decision amongst ourselves that we weren't going to portray Hitler because he's had enough stage time. And in many ways, I think what I find really magical about theater making is we agree, like the audience and us, we agree to this creative, imaginative act whereby we tell you that this violin is a baby and you believe us. And so in the same way, we want to, I'm not going to say embrace the limitations of the theater, but we can't depict everything exactly as it may have been. So how do we magically conjure up these images for you in a way that's emotionally resonant, rather than following strict naturalism?
I think it's worth saying that the development of the piece, I can't remember what we put in the programme, but we first wrote the show in late 2019, early 2020, and we performed it in London for 1 week at a festival that happens underneath Waterloo train station in all of the tunnels. It was called the Vault Festival, and that was sort of where we were able to start making theatre. It no longer exists, sadly, but it was a great platform for young artists with very little money. And so we were able to put this together, myself and Sasha, Dave, who plays the guitar, Metropolitan Stefan. The three of us were in the show from the original with 2 other actors at that time, and Sasha and I wrote a script. We then brought it to them and we workshopped things on its feet, and we had 1 hour, that was the limitation for the festival. We performed that the week before COVID. We finished on the 15th of March 2020.
Wow.
So we managed to do five or six shows in front of an audience who everybody confused and terrified and hugging each other when they probably shouldn't have been. And we put a quick little joke in of Boris shaking hands with people and then hand sanitising himself, which worked really well, and I'm really glad I did it. And then we had COVID, and we work in the arts, which meant that we had to do other things for a while. And then we were able to come back to it last year and further develop it. And we brought Laurie and Claire in as our ensemble. So we've been working together as a cast of 5 for the last year or so. We went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival last August, and then we were allowed a sort of 70-minute limit, and then we were transferred that show to London, and then we had the opportunity to come here incredibly, and so we've now, I think, about 80 minutes. There is so much more to this, as you can tell from watching it, there is so much more to this story than we would ever be able to tell you on stage. We've tried where possible to include extra information in the programme or on our website.
Or in the play text.
Or the play text, which is available. They let us put some information at the back. But the development of the piece has been in many different stages, and we initially made the show without a director. We did it all ourselves, and then we brought our director and dramaturg Hauer-King, who is a member of the Westminster Synagogue in London, and she introduced us to Avinu Malkeinu and Shalom Aleichem, which was music we are not Jewish, and music that we would not have thought to include and probably wouldn't have been appropriate to have come from our thoughts to include. And then working with a Jewish director and dramaturg meant that we were able to give more of a voice to the Jewish story within this story. There are stories within stories, and a couple of quick things that I will say is that I was invited to the European Parliament last March with Boris IV, who is the heir apparent of Bulgaria. They don't have a monarchy at the moment. He's a sculptor. He's 6 or 7 years younger than me, and we look quite similar. He's got the full receding hairline, and I've got it away. We get on really well, and he invited me, and we went over to a conference at the European Parliament, and it was a 2-hour conference on the topic of the heroic rescue of Bulgaria's Jewish population. And Michael Bar-Zohar, who is an eminent professor who wrote a book called Beyond Hitler's Grasp that we used a lot in our research, he was there and he spoke, and it was wonderful because at the end of his speaking, space was made for representatives of Thrace and Macedonia to stand up and say, we agree, we want you to commemorate the rescue of nearly 50,000 people. That's an incredible thing. But in the same breath, you must always make space for remembering the 11,343 lives that were sent to Treblinka, of which only 12 survived. And I'm glad it was a very mature conversation. You would hope so in the European Parliament, but it was, and it was everybody agreeing this is a very complicated, very grey area of history, and we've battled with it as we've gone through with different versions of it and different ways of thinking. How do you showcase these characters and make it theatrically?
And I think that's one of the interesting points, is that there were different characters that were included in previous versions of the play. We had there's this man whose name was Lolchev, and he kind of was an advisor and Boris's Dunavistic spiritual leader, which is kind of
yoga teacher.
It's basically yoga. Set to kind of a seasonal cycle of music. It's very, very strange. But they would go into the park and do yoga together. And so the scenes where Boris is getting advice used to be Boris and Lolchev, and we kind of it never quite worked. The character wasn't quite doing the right thing, and it wasn't oiling the gears of the narrative to propel it along in the right way. And then through some R&D, which is like research and development time, we tried what would happen if that actually becomes Boris's wife. Maybe the wife doesn't have the power to make the changes, but she's whispering into his ear, trying to affect change. And we also have briefly, there's an amazing part of the reason the first deportation is cancelled was because of a delegation in Kustendil that was drummed up by the local Jewish community, and that delegation marched to Sofia and confronted the cabinet, and we desperately tried to include the guy who was the spearhead of that, Dimitar Peshev, but he was just a little too dull. And so
It was
sadly,
too good.
Too good,
It was-
good,
it
you know,
was-
and so it was
Right.
difficult. We kind of were like, oh, we really want to include the history, but it's not. It's only slowing down the story, and we didn't feel like we could justify adding another character into the mix when there's already. Do you have
well,
this
I
a
mean,
lot?
you brought up like 3 things there that I want to respond to. And the first is including the deportation, because this is something in telling the story of the Kindertransports, that there's one way to tell it, that it's a very triumphalist story. The children were saved, and I feel that you always have to mention that the parents weren't, and that yes, 10 to 15,000 children were saved, and this is really important. It's led to some of us in this theater today being alive, but their parents were not saved. In many cases, siblings were not, and I think, and 1.5 million children were murdered. So you always have to mention both of those, and how do you do it? And yes, I wanted to say also something about the way you use narration and repetition that was really interesting, and that you couldn't do in a film context,
No.
but really worked on stage, that you can play with narration and play with what characters are saying and what a number of narrators are saying. So, but your question was?
I was going to say, so we struggled, or we were constantly battling in the crafting of the story of which characters to include and how to structure pacing. But with your interviews and things,
Yes.
how do you select what gets included into the fabric of the documentary that you weave?
So in the documentary, and in the documentary, The Kindertransports, I interviewed about 40 people on, and this is long ago, on audio tape to see who I wanted to interview on film, because I was shooting actual 16 millimeter silver halide film, which I love. But then I interviewed people, I talk, and I gather. I mean, the way I work is I gather lots, and then I watch it, and I watch it again and again. And yes, I go between having the transcripts and then watching on screen, seeing what words are important, also how they're saying it, and then I play, and then I put things one against each other and see what works and what doesn't. Some of the things in every film, I work as an editor also, and sometimes there are scenes that I love that are my favorite scenes, but they don't advance the film. They put a dead stop, and they have to go.
Yeah.
But it's for me, it's the actual working on it, the really seeing what works and what doesn't. Because you can have something in text, and then when you read it aloud, I imagine that you suddenly realize, wait, what was I thinking? This is, and it's so hard when you have someone, a character that you want for various reasons to include, and you realize you can't. Yeah. Because you can't tell all the stories, especially when you're working with historical facts, and that's a whole other question. Truth claims, whose truth, what truth, how to tell truth, and how to make it come to life in some way. And you'll have to leave something out. You just hope that, I think what's really important is research, and doing as much research as you can so that you think you know a lot, and you have a point of view, and also some kind of allegiance to a truth. And then you develop from there.
Absolutely, and it's so fascinating too, because there's a fantastic book called The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which is a tremendous non-fiction portrayal of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. And what she very quickly posits, you realize, is that they were just 5 women. This whole narrative of 5 sex workers being systematically murdered by Jack. We don't even know if it was one person. So it was about all of this narrative framing, and what she does is she just presents their lives from census records, from an enormous amount of historical research. And I asked her, because at the time I was working on a play about Salem witch trials, and I said, there's so little that survives from 1692. How do I fill in the gaps between what we simply do not know? And she said exactly that. She said, do as much research as you can so you know how a woman in the 1600s would have lived. And if you really know that inside and out, you can start making extremely informed decisions about going, what would be likely for this character, or what feels right.
And it's worth saying, and you'll have picked up on this, I'm sure, watching this evening. We weren't going for realism per se in every moment with each character. I don't think that is not the play that we chose to write. Somebody else would write a very, very good play, I'm sure, with that intention behind them. Big intention for us, and certainly making work in the UK. I grew up in a very rural, farming, working class area, and there isn't a lot of theatre. There is. You have to travel miles, and I'm sure it's true in this country as well. There are pockets of the country where you have to travel very far to access the sort of art that is available maybe in New York or in London or in places like that. And there's also a disparity of education throughout the country. And history and politics are things that, in the area that I grew up, which is a very military area, there's a lot of air bases and things nearby, people have a real staunch Britishness. They're royalist and they believe in, but history and politics at school was boring, and often they were told they weren't very smart, they didn't understand it. People are really alienated often by history, politics and theatre, those words. And to try and make a piece of work that is as accessible as possible to as wide an audience as possible, whether we take it to fringe festivals or we tour to rural areas, is really, really important to all of us involved, but certainly to myself. And in the UK, anybody who's familiar with the UK television, you might be aware of, there's a few TV shows called Dad's Army, Blackadder. There are certain comedies that were made that this sense of British exceptionalism. And there's a lot of good things about Britain, and there's a lot of good things about America. But there are stories from everywhere else that we just never talk about, and it was trying to find that fusion of telling them in a style that is recognisable enough. And when it comes to individual characters, we've peppered them with anecdotes that we found through research of things that were true. Filov, the Prime Minister, was the president of the Penn Society. On the day that Boris allied with Germany, it was written in diaries that he celebrated by having double dessert. Some of the things that sound really silly and that sound like we've made them up are actually really true. And we don't know who Boris. I don't know who Boris was. I haven't got any footage. What I have done is met some of his descendants, which is interesting because you get a sense of something passed on. But also we read these anecdotes about him. He was a lover of locomotives and of gardening, and there were anecdotes of him going out and meeting his people. He was also the leader of a country in the early 1940s that allied with Germany. So he was absolutely right-wing. And many would say he was fascist. He was just not as fascist as some of the worst fascists. I don't know what kind of compliment that is, but there are many accounts on either side of who Boris was, good, bad. I don't think it is as simple, and we've tried not to be as simplistic as that. This is a really grey area of history, as we've said. Good people do bad things, and bad people do good things, and we want to hold all of that to be true. Sorry, I've monologued forever.
It feels like that speaks to kind of what you were saying about, like, when you present a story, you need to have your own personal thesis.
Right, yes, because there is no, I remember when I was in film school, and it's this for documentaries, what is objective truth? Is there objectivity? And, of course, no. But if you have your thesis, if you're clear about your point of view, then so you're coming from that point of view, and you're not saying this is the truth, the only truth. Which brings me also to a question of tone, which I love the tone, and tone can be so difficult because you make a false step and you lose people, or you waver in and out of tone throughout a work, and that's also tricky. But I found this really worked.
Well, thank you. One of the things that we realized in tackling this subject matter was that audiences need to listen in a very specific way because there's so much information, and we quickly found that both music and humor served to punctuate so that people had time to synthesize what was actually going. Because there's so many ovs, evs, and itches in this poor Bulgarian country. Do you know what I mean? And it's a lot to take in, and we know that we're really, whipping you through it. And so, what became very apparent very early on was that the humor is not there to make this just a black comedy because we wanted to, but it was going. Each and every beat is there for a very specific reason, and each tool is doing something slightly differently. But yeah, I think you're right that it is a tricky thing to continue to do, and often like night to night, it's very very different based off of our relationship with you, the audience, in that one day. Because some folks find something hilarious, some we've had audible gasps and all sorts. You know what I mean? So you have to be very reactive and live to what's happening.
That's your question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, is it time
I think
now
it's
for us? Yes, so you be the first.
As an historian, I know we don't cover the dark part of it.
You speak up.
As an historian, professional historian, I know you didn't talk about the dark part of this episode when the Bulgarians refused to allow any other Jews who were not Bulgarians entrance to Bulgaria. They turned them away. This is not a case of the Balkans, which it did accept. And we're able to wind up with, in fact, more Jews than we started with at the end. My question to you really is this. One, I thought it was a great performance. The music was terrific. You did a great job. Where are you going from this? We're trying to go to Broadway.
We've
So I
only
think
just opened.
The question I think really was what next for the show. But you are. I'll pick up on something you said earlier than that, which was you are right. There are elements of the darker sides that we haven't included. There are also so many accounts of the wonderful work that, as Michael Balzohar describes them, the extraordinary ordinary people of Bulgaria. We would love to continue to see this show tour. We've got plans to tour it around the UK. We'd like to tour it around Europe as well and bring it back to the US. In terms of as a show, whether it scales up, I don't know. That's for somebody with money to let me know if it's possible. But we've certainly got the idea that we together would love to see this story turned into a TV show at some point. Whether that's us or whether that's somebody else, the story warrants an episodic, real investigation of the fuller story. So whatever, if anybody can help us achieve that, we'd love
anyone
that.
at the BBC?
Yeah.
I want to thank you very much for this. Some of us here are from the American Jewish Committee, which is one of the major American Jewish defense organizations. We have an international slang to us. We call ourselves the State Department of the Jewish People. We have been meeting with 5 or 6 of us are here tonight. We, all of us, including the last gentleman who spoke, have met with the Bulgarian Council of Generals, ambassadors to both the UN and the United States over the past several years. And we've been anxious to get this out to people to know what happened. Everybody knows about saving the Danish Jews. But because of the Iron Curtain situation, for 50 years, nobody knew what was happening in Bulgaria. And it's hard to get it across now. So I just want to express my great appreciation for what you're doing. And by the way, I thought this was a great book, piece of writing, and wonderful acting.
Thank you very much.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to say that the way to support the work is to tell your friends to buy tickets while it's here in New York. So really, when you go out of the theater, tell people to get their tickets.
Yes, that's what someone did for us last night. Very cool, we got it.
Oh, amazing.
Excellent.
First of all, I want to reiterate thank you. I'm curious, after reading the playbill, you found the book. I'm trying to figure out 2 things. One, a timeline of how the book that you found went. Were you two working together at the time you found it? How it got written? And also, at any point, was it a stage show, a normal enter a set, with the set built and enter a door and things like that? How did it become this? Because, by the way it was represented with these things, with the train, with Hitler, to me, is theater. Because the original theater was someone standing up in a cave and saying, there was this big thing, let me show you what it looked like, and just pretending to be it, which is what you guys were doing. So that was, to me, brilliant.
Thank you.
But I sort of just want to know, obviously very quickly,
Yeah.
what the process was from finding the book to where we are now.
Okay, so the book was called Crown of Thorns by Stefan Gruoff. And Stefan Gruoff was the son of one of Boris's cabinet advisors. It was published, off the top of my head, I can't remember, in the 70s, I believe, 73. Anyway, it wound up on my grandfather's bookshelf. And Joe and I play King and Queen in the show, but we're also, in fact, a real-life couple as well. So we had a lot of very late-night arguments over script changes and constant pacing around the house, muddling things over. So it's sort of, in many ways, because I lack boundaries between work and life, it has been 4 years of at-home R&D. But the way that this play came about to be presented in this style is, this is in fact the 4th show that our theatre company, Out of the Forest Theatre, has produced. And it started out with a little show called Bury the Hatchet, which was about Lizzie Borden, but really about how we contextualize and view women's guilt or innocence based off of these completely arbitrary external forces. Did she cry enough? Was she crying too much? And so it was, but it was me and 2 other guys from drama school, from my drama school year, and we had no money, but we said, what can place us in 1892? And very quickly we realized bluegrass music, that murder ballads from the late 19th century, that's exactly how we're going to situate ourselves in this time and place. And so from there we knew that music was always going to be an element in our shows. And this kind of podcast-like cacophony of little vignettes was the way that show was written as well. And so we've then kind of lent into that style, and each play that we do has an ensemble that guides the audience through the story, and then also gets the fun of getting to play lots and lots of different characters to build the world. But again, I think what I was saying before about when you endow an object, you believe it to be real, and I think that is something only theater can do, and what a joy to get to do that together, to play make-believe together, because obviously in film you would never get away with that, but
Right, but the world of AI is coming, we'll see what happens.
But there will always be a need for live performance.
Yes.
Because meeting together in a room and sharing stories, human
Yes.
beings have been doing before they knew what to call it a story, Since the dawn of time, that is how people have communicated with their children and members of their tribe. They've shared stories, they've put it on the wall. And Sasha's a huge Shakespeare lover, and I am a big fan of, there's a lot of very old English comedies from the time of the interregnum between Charles I and Charles II, when England didn't have a monarchy for 11 years, and Oliver Cromwell banned theatre, and all of the really good actors and writers moved to France, and all of the really bad ones stayed in England and did it in the back room of pubs, and did it illegally, and did it anyway, and used what they had and they could, and there is something that I think we will always retain. Lovely as it would be to have more money than we have, the idea of how do you make something on a shoestring and then upscale it. Don't come in with the big ideas. Come in with the small. How can we? The violin is the baby, and I'd have met Simeon, who is still alive in '86 or thereabouts, '86 or '87, and he does know that he's played by a violin in the play, and he was okay with it. So,
but you couldn't do in film. You could never do 2 coat racks being a train, and with the lights on it, which again, from the point of view of sitting here, was just brilliant to see. It was a wonderful portrayal.
That's brilliant.
Yes, I just wanted to say that it was just delightful and surprising to me. All I knew before I walked in this room 2 hours ago was that Bulgaria had saved its Jews too, and nobody knows about this. I don't know where I picked that fact up, but I didn't know any details at all. And secondly, I thought you were going to do a lot of music that it was folk music. This is to be from Bulgaria, or Jewish maybe from Europe, but not that I was going to hear "This Land Is Your Land" or "Side You On" or stuff that I grew up on, that kind of, and you included as though this just belongs here, which was wonderful in that it was so universal. I think the only thing I didn't care for were the cheap, easy jokes like "Make Bulgaria Great Again," that kind of stuff. I mean, that's just happening too often. You could just get rid of those.
Yeah. Do you know what?
We'll take it up with the publisher.
Come on, don't get we're intelligent.
No, I know, and I love that.
We
And
get the point.
I love that there are. Do you know what? I'll be completely honest with you. As a writer and a human being, I love that there are some bits of the play that you don't like, and I tell you why that is. It's because the people who need those jokes won't like other bits that you did like, and I agree. And we have had people say this, whereby there are certain lines that it seems like cheap and easy, and they are cheap and easy to a certain type of person. But my Uncle John and my Auntie Bev, they need that. Because the history of the if I get to drag them into the door to come to a theatre, something they've not been in for 40 years, I promise you those are the lines that are going to go for them. And it's taste, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Well, it's
I
also
suppose.
information. It's
Yes.
Making a leap in the connection between then and now.
Right,
Yeah.
but that brings up for me, I want to talk about, when you talk about the
Yeah.
university and songs from different periods, that why do a history play? Why make a documentary? It cannot only be about that one level, about showing what happened in the past. To make it have meaning, to make it rich, to give people something really to walk away from, it has to be something about the present moment that you're in also. I mean, maybe you disagree completely.
Oh no, this is one of my favorite things that I debate people on endlessly. Is they go, oh, but history's in the past, and you go, well, it wasn't in the past for the people living it in the moment, And loads and loads of people, you ask them, if you could go back in time, if you could go back in history, what would you change? So many people say, I'd go back and I'd kill Hitler, and they entirely forget that each choice they're making now ricochets onwards. So actually it's important to be mindful of your choices now, and the past and the present are in constant dialogue with each other. And I just don't, I think anyone who thinks that because it happened 50 years ago or 80 years ago or 200 years ago that it isn't relevant is choosing to not have a very open mind about.
I will add, you're absolutely right, but so am I. And that's the beauty. That is the beauty of storytelling and of taste. And I absolutely agree with you, and also disagree with you at the same time. And we'll have to just get to know each other better and figure out where it is we agree and disagree on other things, because that's the beauty of.
There's a raised hand way in the back there.
Hi, Sasha, you have Bulgarian heritage. So do you have a Bulgarian point of view on this story? I didn't know this.
I didn't know either.
Bulgarians
I had no
know this
idea.
stuff? Do they
Well,
know
so-
that they have a king dumped in on them? Do they know all this stuff that has happened in their history? Or has it all been erased by the various occupations?
So you see it differently amongst different generations. So during the communist period, it was really not the communist agenda to suggest that the church and the monarchy did good things. So it was almost fully excised from the school curriculum. And you do now have people that know about it, but it's not one of those things that's integrated into the storytelling of their national identity. So yeah, more and more the the older generations are like, oh yeah, so we can talk about this thing that my grandparents or whatever had to keep stum about. So there's this kind of, yeah, it's interesting. I would love to.
I really love the play, and I brought people here tonight, so I'm very delighted that they liked it. Because it's a little quirky, and I liked everything about its quirkiness, and I liked your moving back and forth with non-Bulgarian things. But I used to do, in college, I did Bulgarian folk dancing, and I loved the music. Where did you all learn to sing like that?
So,
it was incredible.
Thank you very much, that's very kind. So, Desi Stefanova, who runs the London Bulgarian Choir, who incidentally is married to a fellow.
Really, but yeah, we met her in London. Runs the London Bulgarian Choir, and as it happens, she's married to a man whose mum lives round the corner from my parents, 120 miles from London, and I've known her my entire life. It was just very funny. We met once in London, and then a few months later, just out for a walk in a field in the countryside,
Bumped into each other.
Kismet, and we knew there was so much surrounds the making of this show that has just dropped into place and felt like it made sense.
But yeah, so she led us in a workshop on that sort of musical style and taught us that song. So we have.
How long did it take you? I mean, it's hard singing. I know this. So, how long did it take you to do it? To learn?
That's a very good question. I mean, we had.
I don't sing in the show, so I have an easy
We had
job.
2
really.
weeks of rehearsal, and very little of that time was spent on dedicated music. So the fellow who plays the guitar, David Leopold, is an incredible singer-songwriter, and his music is on Spotify, should anyone wish to listen. And so he has been very instrumental, if you'll excuse the pun, in developing the musical language of the show and having all of the musical motifs reintegrated kind of throughout. So it was a huge collaborative effort. But Desi came in for an afternoon session and taught us Kavalsviri. Yeah.
One session.
They're actors.
They're just
They-
very
This is what we
good.
do.
Yeah.
Should we do
Maybe one.
another?
Yeah. Let's do one
Question.
last question before people.
Still haven't said what's in the book. Is it
What's in the
fiction, is it nonfiction, the book you found?
Oh, it was a biography, nonfiction.
A biography of?
King Boris III,
Oh,
called Crown of
Crown of
Thorns.
Thorns.
But again, written by the son of one of his advisors. So take what is written with whatever pinch of salt you want. And likewise, I think we've done our absolute best to try and read everything in the English language about Boris III that we could find. And if anything else is published, we'll read that and we'll update. But it's in the back of the printed edition. I think we have included a bibliography of everything that we
So all of our
we were able
sources
to
are in
use. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Another time.
What I will say is if anybody doesn't want to shoot off, we'll stick around for 5 minutes, grab us and ask.